Welcome back, everyone. For those of you here, we hope you enjoyed lunch. For those of you at home or at the office elsewhere, the same thing, of course. So welcome back to this next session. And what we wanted to do now was broaden the picture a little bit to look beyond Germany. We heard our first panel of journalists earlier today saying that the European and indeed the international dimension is not being, or often has not been, sufficiently taken into account here in the national German energy and climate debate. Well, we're not going to follow in the same vein. So we have a speaker from the EU and a speaker from the US to talk us a little bit through what is happening in each of those regions on climate and energy policy, and also how those approaches and policies compare a little bit, and also, of course, how they interrelate. They'll come together in just a few days' time at COP26, and I suppose the G20 before then. And there are specific proposals on the table, notably also the plan for a carbon border tax or a carbon border adjustment mechanism at EU level, which would obviously have an impact on other parts of the world. And that's one of the issues we wanted to talk about, the concept of a global climate club. Is that something which is more just than just an idea on paper? So we have two speakers in this next session, and as previously, you're very welcome to send in questions via the Zoom chat, or if you're here in the room, to put them to us live as we get going. We've got 45 minutes, so this will take us through till 2:15. So our two speakers, we have Jake Werksman, a principal advisor for the international dimension of EU climate policy at the European Commission. Welcome to you. I guess you're pretty busy this week, so it's a real pleasure to have you with us. He's been working on the international parts of EU climate policy for almost 10 years now, and basically heads up all of the EU's work when it comes to the Paris Agreement and the follow-up from that, everything to do with the UNFCCC, also international bilateral partnerships, everything linking climate and international, and is originally an international lawyer. And then his counterpart on the American side, an equally warm welcome to Andrew Light. In your program, it may still say Jonathan Pershing, but COP26 is taking priority has to take priority in some agendas. And I think Andrew is an excellent substitute for Jonathan. Andrew is Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs at the US Department of Energy, who served as Senior Advisor and India Counselor in the second half of the Obama administration to the US Special Envoy on Climate Change, and was also on the staff climate advisor to John Kerry. So again, and previously also affiliated with the World Resources Institute. So again, someone very, I think very experienced on the field of international climate policy. So what we wanted to hear from each of you, and we can start on home turf perhaps with you, Jacob. What is the EU, I guess your view on what the EU is getting up to on climate and energy policy? Obviously Fit for 55 is the starting point, and more particularly what that means in the international context. And obviously, I think looking ahead to COP26, we'd be very interested in your views on the latest around that. So if you each take 5 or 10 minutes, and then after that we can follow up, you can react to one another, and we can build in some questions. So go ahead.
Okay, great. And a pleasure to join you today. Indeed, it's a very busy time. In fact, I'm spending much of the afternoon packing for Glasgow. We will be heading north to COP26. Starting tomorrow morning. As you say, I guess this meeting is on home turf in the sense that it's broadcast out of the EU. And so I would expect that many of the audience members are already relatively familiar with EU climate and energy policy. But let me run through it just very quickly to provide some context. We've been at this for nearly 2 decades in terms of putting in place policies to get European greenhouse gas emissions under control. And there's a kind of a constant approach to the way in which we've been putting in place climate policy. One of which is that it is science-driven. So as the science has improved over time, our understanding of the nature of the challenge, but also the solutions, we have adjusted our policies accordingly. And I'll get into a little bit more detail of that in a moment. But it's never been just about climate and energy policy. It's always been at the center of a kind of an industrial strategy, a strategy for making the EU more competitive, more resilient economically, more innovative economically. So it's never just been about cutting emissions, but also about trying to strengthen and build the EU economy in the right direction. It has been helped by the fact that it's always been backed by a strong level of public awareness and support for climate action that translates not just to demonstrations on the street most recently in terms of demanding that the EU do more, but also if you look across the broad spectrum of European political parties, you'll see that many of them from the left to the right embrace the climate science and support the EU taking the lead in cutting its emissions. Part of that support, I think, over the past decade and a half has been provided by the fact that European Union climate policy is always based on a sense of sharing the effort. So when we sit down and we set a target for the EU, that target needs to be shared across the different member states, taking into account their level of GDP, their energy base. But increasingly, it's also led us to focus on the challenge of what's happening at the community level to make sure that as the EU transitions away from a dependence on fossil fuels, we're providing support for those communities that will be undergoing the most significant transformations. So, for example, supporting those communities that have been dependent upon the production of fossil fuels, or more recently, internal combustion engines. So fairness and equity within the EU has always been a key element of ensuring that the public is behind what it is that the EU does to get its emissions under control. And then finally, all of our actions within the EU have been part of a multilateral process. So we have negotiated and fully participated in the Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol that succeeded it in 1997, and now much of what we do is in the context of the Paris Agreement goals and the Paris Agreement processes that follow up on setting those goals. So turning specifically to Paris and the Fit for 55 package, which I think will reflect all of these basic elements of the DNA of European climate policy, we started out in the Paris Agreement with a pledge of cutting our emissions by at least 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. But since then, in reaction to the latest science, but also in reaction to the demand of the European public, but also political parties that we do more, the greenest European Parliament ever elected was elected. And in turn, they put in place a European Commission that has as its core the European Green Deal, the key set of policy instruments that this Commission has set out to achieve in the five years for which it will be in place, but also extending well beyond that in terms of the reach of the policies. That led us to raise our Paris target from at least 40% to a cut of at least 55% from 1990 levels by 2030, and to roll out beginning at the beginning of this year, very importantly, the set of policies that will be necessary for the EU to achieve those emissions reductions. So the Commission made its Fit for 55 proposals in the spring of this year, and they are now, those essentially 12 pieces of legislation, proposed legislation, are now making it through the process of co-legislation. So the Commission proposes, but now it must be endorsed by the Council and the European Parliament before it becomes law. The Parliament and the Council, of course, have already endorsed the European Climate Law, which contains that 55% target, plus a commitment by the EU to be net zero by 2050. This is now part of the core framework law that's in place within the EU. And what Fit for 55 will do when it's finalized and implemented is to ensure that the EU follows through on that domestic legal commitment, and of course in doing so, follows through on its commitments under the Paris Agreement as well. For those who have been following European climate policy, there's much in the Fit for 55 package that will be very familiar. It starts with what is at the core of European climate policy, our emissions trading system, the cap and trade system that applies to the sources of greenhouse gases within our power and manufacturing sectors. That ETS will be tightened in terms of its targets to align itself with the At Least for 55 and the pathway to net zero. There will also be updates to the effort sharing regulation, which determines how that Fit for 55% target will be shared amongst the member states, and that approach to equity that I described before. There will also be revisions to the way in which we manage emissions from our land use change and forestry sectors. There will be new standards for emissions of CO2 from cars and vans. We will be updating our renewable energy targets to align with Fit for 55, ramping up our energy efficiency improvement commitments as well. So all of that is based on revisions of existing law. There are some new pieces of legislation that have been put in place as well to ensure that we're accelerating towards these more ambitious targets. This includes a new but separate cap and trade system that will apply to the providers of fossil fuels to the transportation sectors and the building sectors. And it will also include more rollout of policies to ensure that our infrastructure is ready for the rapid growth in zero emissions electric vehicles that we expect in response to the much tighter standards on CO2 emissions from cars and vans. There is also a significant new external dimension of this policy. You mentioned it in your opening remarks, a proposal for a carbon border adjustment measure to be put in place at the border with regard to products being imported from those same sectors that are covered by the EU ETS. This was a policy that was thought to be essential in order to ensure, as the EU moves forward with these much tighter caps on our emissions, that those same emissions aren't being generated elsewhere as consumers or suppliers search for supply chains that might be overseas, but more cost affordable. So it was felt necessary that we put in place an additional charge at the border for these products in order to prevent that, what we call carbon leakage from the tighter cap within the EU economy. I'm happy to get into more details on that, but that's obviously a new and very visible and controversial aspect of the Fit for 55 proposal. So in terms of what this all means for COP26 and the expectations for COP26, those of you who have been following the process know that we, together with the UK COP presidency and together with the United States and other ambitious countries, have been calling for COP26 to provide evidence that the way in which countries have been designing their targets is rapidly aligning with the Paris Agreement temperature goals, and in particular can provide a credible narrative that we are on track to preventing global average temperature rises of above 1.5 degrees Celsius. We believe that the Fit for 55 package demonstrates how it is that a major economy can do that. And we're hoping that leadership by example through what we call the diplomacy of ambition, our outreach bilaterally, our outreach to the G7 and the G20 process, and the statements that we'll be making and the messages that we bring to COP26 will help inspire others to follow suit. We think increasingly major economies are moving in the same direction. Many of them are setting targets that are of equivalent ambitiousness to the EU's, but we haven't seen yet, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from Andrew on this, is the important next step. How, after you set targets, do you in fact persuade others that you're taking those targets seriously and putting in the policies necessary to achieve them? So that's a key element of COP26, making sure that we're all collectively on track to 1.5. There are other elements as well that we can get into in the conversation as well that shows our commitment to the importance of multilateral rules, putting in place a transparency and accountability system at the international level that will be important outcomes from Glasgow as well. And then finally, because the title of the session is about clubs, I suppose we'll have an opportunity to reflect on whether or not there are enough countries that are aligning to the same level of ambition that the EU is showing to be able to create some kind of community of leadership that would be able to define both what is the cost of membership, how ambitious do you need to be to join such a club, but also the benefits of membership in such a club. What would you be able to gain by joining with others that are demonstrating equivalent leadership?
Okay.
Thanks, and I'm looking forward to Andrew's remarks as well as the conversation to follow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate Fit 55 is a mammoth package and it's not easy to to run through in just a couple of minutes, but you did a good job. One question before we turn to Andrew. What would you say the EU is looking for specifically from the US at COP26?
Well, I think we've actually been working very, very hand in hand on this, preparing for COP26 and setting high expectations for it. I think what we're hoping to see more of, and I know this has been a challenge, we're all watching US domestic politics closely, is more evidence of how it is that the US will be following up on the targets that it set for itself. What's happening with Congress in terms of the reconciliation bill, but very importantly, we're still expecting to hear from the US what it intends to do through the existing legislative and regulatory authority it has to make those important next steps towards its 2030 target. Okay,
so how the US will follow up on the targets it had set itself, and what kind of legislation it will be able to put to use to make that happen. Okay, yeah, that's a fair point, I think, with everything going on in Congress at the moment. And that's, I think, a perfect moment to bring you in, Andrew, to fill us in a little bit. I guess we've all been following the news, but a bit on, I guess, how you would frame President Biden's ambitions on climate change, and I guess the scope you see for bringing these to fruition, with the difficulties the plans obviously currently face in making it into legislation. So go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's always a delight and honor to be on sharing any platform with my good friend Jake Worksman, who I've known for decades now, and we both have the hair to prove it, I believe. But Jake's wears his much better than I do. So I'm attempting very early here. I have to just, make myself joke a bit to get myself ready for this conversation. But to be serious. Yes, Jonathan Pershing is in London now with Secretary Kerry, preparing to go to Glasgow, but this is, I'm also in a full-scale Glasgow preparation as well. The US Department of Energy will have the second biggest delegation after the US Department of State in Glasgow. We are going there to demonstrate American leadership, both on deployment of clean energy technologies and on the innovation side on creating the next generation of technologies that will truly make net zero a reality. So I will be there for the full 2 weeks of the meeting, starting with accompanying Secretary Granholm next week for the energy portion, and then continuing through the following week. And we will be meeting with dozens and dozens of countries as we try to move forward and help the rest of the world to make net zero a reality. In terms of the overall approach of the United States, I'd say that the clear target is already there, and Jake asked the right question about how we're going to hit it. But the president announced this at the April climate summit that he convened last spring. The U.S. our new target under the Paris Agreement, our new NDC, as the lingo goes, is a 50 to 52% reduction in our emissions by 2030. And included in that is a very concrete sectoral goal, which we will see an accompaniment of other sectoral goals very soon, of 100% clean electricity, I should say, by 2035. This is all in service of a pathway which is identical to the European Union of net zero emissions by 2050. But clearly we have a lot of catching up to do. And the one thing that I'm extremely proud of, and I think that in the climate community which I travel in the United States, which is now in office with President Biden and Secretary Granholm and Secretary Kerry, we have seen a resurgence, I think, of cooperation and goodwill with the European Union and most of the large European member states to try to work together and show that we can be on the same side. The past, I think, when we might have seen small issues, I think divide us unnecessarily, I think is gone. And so I would sort of join Jake in saying that I've seen nothing but cooperation with our European partners, both in the Commission and in the member states. And I'll give you a little bit more detail on that in just one minute. That is absolutely essential because I think that it is impossible, literally, for the world to get to any chance at hitting the temperature targets in the Paris Agreement, let alone making net zero a reality without seeing the US and European partners working together. We have to work with all the major emitters, obviously, and I hope to see some kind of progress at the end of this week at the G20 on the doorstep of COP26. But I think that the narrative that's changed in the United States, which was there in the Obama administration when I served in the Obama administration and previous Democratic administrations in the United States, is that the narrative is much crisper and much clearer on exactly the way that Jake put it at the top, which is that this is not just simply a climate issue. It is surely driven by climate science, absolutely and necessarily, and that is why the urgency of trying to get things done and the reality of what we see on the ground is getting more and more palpable. But the way Jake put it, that what you're after with the Fit for 55 approach is to strengthen the overall EU economy is exactly the same narrative that you see in the United States today. And I think that is one of the things that's bringing us together. We call it Build Back Better as the domestic version, Build Back Better world. Labels don't matter as much, but the best way that I think we can put it, and it's somewhat overly simplified, but I think it really speaks to the issue. President Biden says it, and Secretary Granholm, Secretary of Energy, who I work for, says it, and I've been saying it as well for many years. Climate action is job creation, fundamentally. It is the biggest job creation, therefore economic stimulation, sustainable economic stimulation we will see in our generation, in our children's generation, in our grandchildren's generation, if we do it right. If we get it wrong, it won't be. Climate change, the impacts will oversweep our economies and cause billions and billions and billions of damages, in addition to the billions of damages we're already causing every year. But if we get this right, we can fundamentally transform the economy, create millions upon millions of good paying jobs, and create truly sustainable societies in a way that we have not seen before. And we want to do it in a way, and I know that Jake joins me in this sentiment, in a way that sees a transition that leaves absolutely no community behind. And that's essential. And I think it's taken us, at least in the United States, I'll speak only for us, a while to come and really focus on that core message. But this is stuff that we've been seeing and talking about for decades and decades. We finally figured out that this is really the way that we need to talk about it, because it is absolutely true and it's essential. And so one of the things that I do every single day in my job, running international affairs at the Department of Energy, is to demonstrate that every single bit of the bilateral cooperation that we do and the multilateral cooperation that we do builds jobs in these countries that we're working in, and also builds jobs in America. As we work with our European partners and others around the world to make sure that clean energy goods and services are competitive on the marketplace, they provide the solutions and the options and the alternatives to more coal infrastructure, or indeed other fossil infrastructure that's unabated. And so that is the marketplace we must compete in. That's where we must succeed. If we do it right, again, we will transform our economies in a way that will make them sustainable and lasting for generations. Now, in terms of the particular parts of how it works, and Jake asked the right question, this is the most interesting part of living in Washington right now, where I'm sitting, is watching the daily machinations within the Democratic Party and in the Congress and the Senate writ large about where we're going to get between the Congress and the president on our final two major legislative packages, one in infrastructure and one in the budget. And so I'm not going to predict for you where we're going to land. We've seen things go up and down. But the thing that encourages me every single day is that even when we see certain parts of that legislative package potentially fall off, we see sweeping back in some other way of trying to come together and make up for whatever the loss in emissions you would get from one part of that package to get it back in another part of the package. And that's determined, and I hope to see a success. I would love to see a success by the time that I hit the ground in Glasgow, because obviously that will make my job in answering the very good questions that a colleague and a partner like Jake puts to me, or the commission, or any member state, Germany, France, the UK, anyone in Europe as to how are you going to achieve this. We've got our legislation. What is yours going to be? You will see the much more specificity on the contours sectorally of how the US will hit its target once we get on the ground in Glasgow. And I can assure you that we are trying to do this in as smart a way as possible so that given the current legislative position that we're in, we're only 10 months into this new administration after frankly, and we've got a lot of catching up to do, especially after the last 4 years in the United States. 10 months in this administration, we're going to pick multiple pathways to getting success. And that's absolutely essential because we cannot rely on one single instrument, one single piece of legislation to get us there. In terms of what the stuff that I handle every day, I'm working a lot on building efficiency. I'm working a lot, obviously, on the transformation of the electricity economy and how we work with and interconnect that to the rest of the world. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud to have been part of with our partners at the Commission is the Global Methane Pledge. Truly, scientists estimate that half of the warming that we're experiencing today is because of methane. And this is something that we can take care of. This is easier in some ways to mitigate than carbon dioxide because we're not talking about the entire economy. We're talking about more discrete sectors. And the Global Methane Pledge, which was signed by 3 cabinet secretaries in the United States and 3 commissioners in Brussels and sent out to the biggest emitters in the world just several months ago to try to get them to sign on to this. Now we have over 50 countries signed on to the Global Methane Pledge to reduce aggregate methane emissions 30% by 2030, and they represent some 50%, some 1/3 of total global methane. And I must say that we are taking this up to the wire, as are our partners in Brussels.
Can I ask
We
you
are on the
in a moment, please?
We're on the phone every day. I was on calls this morning, and we're trying to get as many of the top emitters there as possible. Now, let me say a few things about what we're doing just internationally and just in Europe, and not even talking about the rest of the world. But overall, with the Commission, our signature, we have a US-EU Energy Council, long-standing, but now we're doing a big refresh on that, focusing on things like the life cycle analysis of methane emissions and reducing emissions in the natural gas sector, but also most importantly, how we engage third countries. The United States and Europe must come together with a common approach to how we engage other big emitters in the world so that we can offer them a real alternative. In addition to that, with Germany, we just recently launched the US-Germany Clean Energy Partnership, which will focus not only on broader issues of climate policy, but transformational energy technologies, including hydrogen, cross-sector decarbonization that can rapidly advance the energy transition. And clearly, Germany is a leader in this. When I go to Glasgow next week, we will convene the very first meeting of the US-UK new Clean Energy Strategic Partnership, a new initiative launched by the Prime Minister and the President last spring, where we will focus on a number of initiatives, including nuclear energy, to try to drive down emissions.
Andrew, can I ask you to leave
yes,
it?
one more second. On Bastille Day, of course, we launched our new program with France, which had not existed before. Our US-France bilateral clean energy partnership, which will convene again for the first time this December in Paris on the margins of the International Energy Agency meeting. And just last month, Secretary Granholm brought together 24 countries in Eastern Europe to take something the Trump administration had created, the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy Cooperation, and refashion it as a Partnership for Transatlantic Energy and Climate Cooperation to bring together energy security as well as climate resilience and decarbonization. Now, next year, and this is the last thing I say, I promise.
I'm going to have to ask you to stop. No, Jacob's not going to be able to react to anything you've said.
I'm going to say one more thing. One more thing. Next year, we will finish the COP, and we should focus on the COP. But we now have to focus on implementation, and I think Jake will agree with me on this. So 2022 must be the year of implementation of everything we're talking about. And I'd be happy to talk in a second about the different ways that we will focus on making sure that these big numbers, these big pledges actually become reality on the ground.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you to come back to, I mean, everyone is waiting to see whether Biden will come to the COP with the spending packages, the enormous spending packages you mentioned passed or not. I know you can't give a definitive answer to that, but you did mention this is changing day by day. I guess what what do you think could replace the clean electricity performance program, which was a key part, supposedly, of US climate policy going forward? That's not in there anymore. Carbon taxing's not in there. What can you, I guess, name us that is in there that would give the EU and others cause for hope at this stage?
I can't name you I can't name what's in a legislative package until the legislative package is done. But I can assure you that what's going on actively,
what makes you
I
optimistic?
can assure you that what's going on actively in the Hill right now are ways to take the aggregate emissions that you have seen from those programs, repackage them in other instruments through the entire legislative package, and make sure that we wind up in the same place. I have no doubt.
Is there an example of this repackaging? What would be an example?
It would not be prudent of me to talk about those kinds of active negotiations right now going on between the White House and Congress in this forum. I don't want to get ahead of those negotiations. So we're going to see what lands and what comes out of it. But I think that, again, we're modeling out multiple pathways to get to exactly the same endpoint. I'm confident we can get there. And obviously, the way that we're going to get there in part is to make sure that we can always point to the other successes that we see in the world, and we see a success emerging certainly in Europe.
Okay, Jacob, welcome to react to that, and maybe from you an idea of where you see concrete cooperation opportunities between the EU and the US. Is the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism one of those? Is there a common policy towards, I guess, towards the COP, towards other countries, notably China, India, etc.? Methane was an example that Andrew mentioned, of course, with the EU and US have lined up. Where for you do you see, I guess, encouragement at the US domestic level, and where do you see real cooperation opportunities internationally?
Thanks for the question. Let me start by expressing some sympathy for where Andrew and the US is in the policymaking process. I mean, our Fit for 55, as I said in my opening remarks, is still a proposal. So it has to get through our equivalent at the regional level to Congress, the European Parliament, but also the Council of Ministers need to sign off on this package as well. And while I think that there is broad support for many elements of the package, there is some resistance to some. And so there will have to be some kind of trade-offs that take place within our own political process as well. We're not immune to that either. I think there are a couple of distinctions to make. One is that as I said in my opening remarks, the European climate target is that's been codified. So if any individual member state wants to remove a piece of the package, they have to say how it could be replaced and still meet that target. And I think that's a bit what's missing from the US politics at the moment, is a kind of a shared understanding across the different government institutions of what level of ambition the US is prepared to undertake. Incredibly impressive how quickly the Biden administration has, in the past 9 months, been able to not just get up to speed, but to commit itself to a high level of ambition and to work across all areas of the administration, all ministries and their equivalent within the US system, to search for the authority and the tools necessary to get the US on the right track. So I think that it's from that process of discovery that we will figure out where the EU and the US can both can collaborate together in that kind of shared vision of getting to net zero by 2050. Andrew mentioned the US-EU Energy Council as a long-standing area of cooperation, and that's where we're moving ahead on elements of a joint methane strategy. But there, as a result of the summit that we had earlier this year, more institutional machinery was established. There is a trade and tech council that both Andrew and I serve on, that is designed to explore more deeply where we can cooperate on the acceleration of the development of certain technologies and the policies necessary to support them, including trade-related policies. So in that context, we will be looking at things, for example, like the development of approaches to carbon footprinting, so that as we both move towards ensuring that production at home, as well as the products that we import into our economies, are as green as possible, that there is a kind of a standardized methodology for assessing that. I can see that playing out as well in the hydrogen space. Every major economy's plan to get to net zero seems to include the development of hydrogen as a carrier of energy, as well as a storer of energy. And that will require, in order for it to be done right, to make sure that that hydrogen is sourced in net zero energy technologies. So understanding what kinds of hydrogen and how quickly we can introduce it into our production processes, as well as on the consumer end of things, I think will be an important part of EU-US cooperation as well. We always say that we share many of the same values transatlantically, and I think that's also the way in which we will address third countries. We're committed to not just to ambitious climate policy under this administration, but also the need to keep markets free and open to promote and empower citizens in the design of these and other policies. And I think that the messages that the countries that we engage in, the third countries that we engage in, whether they are fellow G7 members or they are the broader mix of countries within the G20, will carry that same set of principles with them wherever we go. I hope that was responsive in part to your question. If not, force me to be more specific.
Are there any questions from people in the room here to either Jacob or Andrew? So we had one question come in online, but I don't see one here. But this was to you, Andrew. Why is the US making partnerships with individual EU countries rather than with the EU? I guess it's in the context of climate energy.
So we have, that's why I wanted to finish the sentences right in my first presentation. And I mentioned our US-Germany partnership, climate energy partnership that we formed since forming the new Biden administration, our new US-UK partnership, which we're convening for the first time at Glasgow, our new US-France climate energy partnership, which we're convening in December in Paris, which we launched on Bastille Day. We have a partnership with 24 countries in Eastern and Central Europe, which we relaunched in Poland last month. And then we have additional deep collaborative partnerships with all of the Nordic countries, with several other countries in the region. And I should. So I don't know that there are many other European countries at this point that we don't have some kind of climate energy dialogue with.
I think the question is more, why not more partnerships at EU level as opposed to bilateral partnerships with individual EU member states?
Well, that is the US-EU Energy Council that Jake and I both referenced. That is the signature platform upon which we have, like, I think four major tracks and many sub-tracks. Yeah.
So it's and for you.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not. It's and is the reality, not just an aspiration in this particular case.
And coming back to, I don't see any other questions here. What Jacob mentioned also is potential areas where he can imagine there might be scope to discuss carbon footprinting, hydrogen. Can you give a thought on those, and also specifically on the EU's carbon border tax plans? I mean, the same issue has come up under the Biden administration. Is this something you can actively imagine working on also as the foundation for a climate club of some sort?
So I don't want to I mean, the Climate Club, literature is incredibly interesting, and in fact, I've written about it in my previous, NGO and academic career. And so it depends on what you mean by a climate club. But I do think that, broadly speaking, the idea that there is some kind of a coalition among countries that exercise common ambition is absolutely what's essential. There's always going to be a necessary limitation on what you can do at the full 190 country UN level. I think we all recognize that. I think the Paris Agreement is the best platform that we could have created in that particular context, where every country works in a consensus process. And so I strongly believe in the potential of the Paris Agreement and the cycles that we've created on it. But I do think you need a group of countries who are committed to ambition. I don't know, I can't tell you today whether or not the United States is going to create a border adjustment mechanism. I can tell you that every major piece of legislation for climate change in US history has included some kind of a border adjustment for similar motivations that we see in Europe. And my firm belief is that once whatever version of the climate border adjustment that Europe settles on comes across the finish line, I do believe that the United States will be very competitive with respect to the carbon content of our goods and services. And right now, I mean, part of my job every single day is to make sure that that can be improved. So one of the things that we are doing constantly is trying to work on how we can reduce emissions, in things like the oil and gas sector, obviously, which is where you absolutely must do that as you move to a world of net zero and move to a world of abated fossil rather than unabated fossil use, but also especially in heavy industry. And that was one of the things that I was particularly pleased that out of the G7 meeting with our European partners and under the auspices of the UK presidency and with Germany, France, Italy, like all the full G7, we created the first ever thing called the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda, the IDA. And the idea, this is the first time you've had a durable platform under the G7 focused on how you decarbonize the hardest to decarbonize sectors in cement, steel, and concrete. And if so, we're working hard on this every single day. And if we do, then when a border adjustment comes online in Europe, I think we'll be more competitive than many other major exporting countries.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to have to wrap up in a moment. A final question to each of you. For each of you, what would success at COP26 look like? And try and be brief, please. And then we'll wrap up. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first, so that Jake should have the last word because he'll be in the negotiating room, like getting the job done. I think that there's lots of ways of measuring success, and I think that it's a confusing year for lots of different reasons. What I'm particularly worried about is that too many people sort of making the false claim that some of the energy price spikes we're seeing right now are somehow caused by the energy transformations that we're seeing now, which is absolutely false. And so one of the things that I think is success is that there is the negotiating package, which I hope will get across the finish line in a way that the US and our European partners see as a success. But for me, the most important thing is we come out of the COP with a launching pad, again, for determination and will to implement all of these aspirations that we've been talking through, the Glasgow breakthroughs, what the Brits have talking about, all the different platforms and declarations and statements that come out, which will be a bewildering flurry and incredibly hard for journalists to cover, by the way. We can cut through that, see what the most important ones are, and really make them a reality in the months to come.
Mm-hmm. So success, in a sense, would be the current energy price crisis not derailing the progress that has been made so far and not preventing, continuation of the determination and will to actually implement what has already been.
Exactly right. And then we come out of Glasgow saying that the energy transition must be managed, which is clearly everybody understands, but people need to understand it better. And two, it means that we must accelerate the transition to create with more diverse supplies of energy than just what we've been locked into in the past, which is causing part of the problem now, which is being, frankly, politically manipulated.
Okay. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned some of this in my opening remarks about the need to show that we're on track to 1.5. We've got to show that as donors, we're delivering the 100 billion that we committed to annually between 2020 and 2025. We got to complete the rule book, et cetera. But I think overall, success depends upon the parties feeling as though the Paris process is working and wanting it to appear as it's succeeding and being prepared to reinvest in it, even if it has fallen somewhat short of the goals that I've just described, because it will. I mean, when we look at the NDCs that have been delivered so far, they don't tell an entirely credible story that we're on a pathway to preventing 1.5 degrees. But what they do tell is that governments are responding to their sense of obligation to the Paris Agreement. And if you look at where we were in 2015 and you compare it to where we are now, countries' commitments have changed dramatically, and they've changed dramatically for the countries responsible for the largest share of global emissions. We're not on track yet, but things are working, and we have to rely upon Paris to keep the pressure on to make sure that those emissions continue to be cut and the finance continues to flow to support those efforts. So we have to make sure that the environment doesn't become toxic. That if we are disappointed in each other in one way or another, we don't lead that into conversations that undermine faith that Paris is and is capable of continuing to deliver. And so, rising above some of the bilateral politics and into the sense of solidarity in the geopolitical space that Paris creates, I think is going to be really important.
Okay, thank you. So in a sense, I guess we also need to manage our expectations. It's as much about preserving and defending and protecting what has already been agreed and making sure that there is a path to then move forward together to actually implement some of those things than about purely setting new goals, new ambitions, and all the rest of it. And I think, very useful to hear the mention of climate finance. On the one hand, there's of course the emission reductions. Some people would say success also means a recommitment and an explanation of how this 100 billion committed to so many years ago a year will be met in terms of climate finance to developing countries. So that's of course the other half of the equation. Thank you both very much. We're going to have to leave it there. I appreciate you both have a lot to do these days more than ever. So a round of applause and thank you very much for your time today and good luck.
Thank you. See you soon, Andrew.
See you there.